About 10 years ago, I started working as a watchman in the parking lot of an old heavy haulage company, where there were about 150 units that were inoperative. The parking lot was located in a somewhat secluded area of the city, and from the moment I arrived, I noticed that the place was quite lonely and quiet, which at first was a bit difficult because I didn't have much to do, especially since my shift was 12 hours, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I didn't have a partner either, since in this parking lot they only required one person. Fortunately, after a few days, I ended up adapting to the solitude and silence of the place. I remember that when I arrived at the company, I was introduced to Damien, who was the previous night shift attendant in my area, but after one of the daytime attendants left the company, he asked to take his place, and it was for this reason that I was hired. Damien was quite a talkative guy, too much I would say, but he was good people. And I remember that one day before I started my first day, he intercepted me in the office and gave me a wooden scapular that, he told me, was blessed. When he gave me the amulet, Damien also told me that if I heard any strange noises, such as crying, whispering, whistling, and the like, to stay calm, press the amulet he gave me and say, "To our fathers." He warned me that there were taunting spirits in that area, and that this was the way to make them go away and leave me alone. I have never been much of a believer in such things, but it seemed very noble of him to go to the trouble of giving me that protection, so I accepted the gift and thanked him. I showed up for work that day and everything went completely smoothly. My job basically consisted of making sure that no one entered the place to try to steal parts from the units that were parked there, so during my shift I used to make several rounds around the place, making sure that no one entered. This company had several parking lots in this area, and a few meters away from this one there was one for operating units. That was where the main office was, the place where we carted all the security personnel, and in that parking lot there were 2 other watchmen at night with whom I could communicate by radio. The first few weeks went by normally, but one night, a couple of months into the job, the first strange incident happened to me. I was finishing the second round of the shift. It was almost midnight and I was walking among the last row of trucks. That's when I began to hear an unusual noise. It was like a kind of hammering, that unmistakable sound of 2 metals colliding. The sound was coming from the other side of the parking lot, where the first row of trucks was, so I quickly pulled out my sidearm and ran towards that place. As I got closer, the sound got louder and louder, and the first thing that came to my mind was that there was someone trying to beat a piece out of one of the trucks. So I started yelling and asking who was there, with the intention of alerting the thief of my presence. However, this did not happen. The hammering kept getting louder and louder, and it came from the last unit in the first row, one of the oldest in the parking lot, a Mack truck from the year 61. The strange thing was that no matter how hard I tried to sharpen my hearing, I could not detect from which part of the truck exactly the sound was coming from. I only knew that it was coming from there. When I was in front of the unit, I asked again who was there, told him I was armed, and ordered him to get out with his hands up, but the sound did not stop. I slowly began to walk around the truck to try to find the person hammering, but there was no one there. And although I kept trying to figure out exactly where in the car the sound was coming from, for some reason I couldn't make it out. The unit didn't have the bed and the parking lot was well lit, so if someone was inside, under or over the truck, they would be easily visible, but there was no one. Even so, the hammering was still heard loud and constant, until from one moment to the next it stopped. It stopped. I was very puzzled, and although I knew it was completely unlikely that the sound was coming from inside the cabin, I still opened the doors and searched with my flashlight, but there was no one there. It was something extremely strange, and while my mind was trying to process what happened, I started to hear exactly the same sound, but now at the other end of the parking lot, the place where I was a moment ago. For an instant I was completely paralyzed, trying to process what was happening and to find some logical explanation for it, but I found none. However, I did my own thing and ran again to the other end of the parking lot, repeating the same thing I had done a moment ago. I reached the unit where the sound was coming from, pointed the gun and asked who was there, again without receiving any answer. I circled the vehicle again to see if I saw anyone, and nothing. After a while, once again, from one moment to the next, it simply stopped. To say I was puzzled is an understatement. At that moment, my heart began to pound and my head was spinning like a carnival machine trying to find explanations. But no, there was nothing that could explain it. After that, I waited to see if I would hear the sound again, but it didn't happen again, so I returned to my sentry box. For an instant, I was tempted to radio the guys in the parking lot next door, but I didn't after all. How could I explain what happened without them thinking I was crazy, or that I had smoked something? However, that was only the first of several unexplainable events that happened to me in that place. But it was one particular event that definitely forced me to run, literally, out of that job, despite the good pay. After that first incident, I came to hear banging on the units, falling objects, and even the barking of a dog, although that may have been real. The fact is that with time I got used to these strange manifestations, although they did not stop being scary, and it is not that they happened every day. It was something sporadic. But whenever something like this happened, I felt a horrible shiver running through my body, and to tell the truth, the scapular that Damien gave me was not much help. But there was one night when I really knew I had had enough. By then I had been working for that company for about 3 years, and like every night, I got ready for another day's work. At that point, it had been almost a year since the last paranormal event, so I was pretty relaxed. However, when it was about 1 a.m., I heard a sound that I immediately recognized, and that put me on alert. It was the scream of a woman. When I heard it, I left my sentry box as fast as I could to see what was happening. The scream seemed to come from the back of the parking lot, about 40 or so meters away from where I was. The sound was as if she was inside one of the trucks in that area. I immediately drew my gun and waited a moment to see if I heard it again, and sure enough I did. I heard another scream coming from the same place. I started up and ran at full speed, while I kept hearing this woman screaming desperately, as if she was terrified. But one thing was clear. The sound came from inside one of the trucks because it sounded as if she was locked up. At that moment, 1,000 things went through my head. The first one being that maybe I was being attacked by someone. This was a lonely and isolated place, so it was perfect for some aberrant to want to do his misdeeds here. As I ran, I followed the sound closely, and it soon became clear to me exactly where it was coming from. I pointed my gun and gave the usual alert voice while I opened the driver's door with a jerk. But what I found inside that old and broken truck is something I will never forget. Immediately after opening the door, the screams died down completely, and it was then that I saw a huge black dog sitting on the truck's seat cushion, staring at me with an almost human expression. At that instant, my blood froze and my body was completely paralyzed. I swear I had never felt so much terror in my whole life, but when I thought I could not feel any more panic, that infernal animal jumped on me. By pure inertia, I jumped backwards, falling from the stirrup and hitting my back hard against the ground, while I squeezed my eyelids tightly and tried to cover my face with my arms, waiting for the attack, but it never came. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes, and there was nothing. At that moment, my heart was about to explode. The level of panic I felt was of such magnitude that I don't even know how my pants were dry. I looked up and the door of the truck was still open, but my friends, I wasn't going to look out there again. So as best I could, I got up, grabbed the gun that had fallen to the side and ran as fast as I could, got out of there like a bullet, got in my car and drove home without looking back. Such was my state when I arrived, that my wife jumped when she saw me enter the door and began to ask me loudly what had happened to me, because she thought I had been assaulted or something like that. That night I didn't dare tell her anything. The last thing I wanted was to have to relive that moment, so I just asked her to hold me. The next day I had a bunch of missed calls from the company's human resources office, so I went there, but I didn't tell them anything about what happened to me. I just put in my resignation and never went back there. Days later, several of my now former colleagues came to visit me, Damien among them, and it was only then that I dared to tell them what I had experienced that night. Then they looked at each other and told me that I had not been the only one who had seen that animal, and that in fact, I was the watchman of that area that had lasted longer, because everyone who had that position before me had resigned within a few months except Damien because he changed shifts. This experience was so traumatic for me that I was forced to seek psychological help, as I constantly had nightmares in which that night was repeated. The psychologist who treated me said that it was probably a case of post-traumatic stress disorder. It took me years to get over what I experienced in that place. But fortunately, I am fine now. I now work as a warehouse worker, but I never worked night shifts again. In 2013, my father suffered a stroke, and although thank God he survived, unfortunately he was left with serious after effects that left him unable to work for life. Dad was always the breadwinner in my home, as my mother dedicated herself to being a housewife and taking care of my two younger brothers and me. However, now things were different in the family, and it was up to my mother and me as the eldest daughter to take care of supporting our home. Since I had just graduated from high school, and my mother had never worked anywhere, we decided to go into business for ourselves. So after selling some belongings and scraping together what was left of our savings after my dad's medical expenses, we bought a hamburger cart. This business was ideal because it allowed us to work at night, so it didn't interfere with my college schedule, and my mom could do the day's work and also take care of my dad and younger siblings. I'm not lying to you, it was a bit tiring to tell you the truth, since we had practically all the time committed, but it was the best we could do for the moment. At the beginning, things were a little weak. We were always with just enough, but little by little the business began to grow and to bear fruit. Besides, this gave us the facility to move to any part of the city, which also gave us the possibility to sell our product outside massive events such as concerts, sports games, and other types of events such as student parties and things like that, which made us start to generate very good profits. However, this also had some drawbacks, and is that usually these events usually end late at night. And if you want to generate, well, sometimes you have to make the sacrifice. And it was just in one of these events, in which the day lasted until late, that I had the terrifying experience that I'm going to tell you about today. On one occasion, there was a baseball game in a stadium that was located in a fairly remote area of the city. It was newly built and had become something like the fashionable sports venue. This event featured two of the top local teams, and the game had been highly publicized on the radio and in the press, so we knew it was going to be well attended. In light of this, Mom and I knew we couldn't miss this opportunity to earn some much-needed cash back home. The event ended around midnight and was a success, both for the organizers and for us because we sold everything. The only bad thing is that the event lasted until around 2 a.m., because it was just when the fans left the stadium that we started selling more hamburgers, and this was something we had to take advantage of. At that time, Mom and I were cleaning up and picking up all the stuff. But then my 13-year-old brother called in desperation telling Mom to go home now, because my dad was having a seizure. The seizures were one of several sequelae that Dad had suffered from the stroke he had suffered 2 years earlier, and while they occurred frequently, that didn't make it any less distressing. Hearing my brother's desperate tone, I told my mom to go home and assist Dad, while I would finish packing up, clean the car, and have it ready for when she returned, so that all that was left to do was to hook it up to the truck and go. Mom hesitated for a bit, as she didn't want to leave me alone there with everything, but at that moment, there were still quite a few people around, as well as other street vendors who were also still gathering their things, so I didn't see a problem with my mom leaving and coming back for me later. However, soon after my mom left, people started to leave the place where we were as well, leaving me more and more alone. I went inside the hamburger cart with the counter already closed, to clean everything and put things away, and when I came out to pick up what little was left outside, I realized that everyone had already left and only 1 or 2 cars could be seen in the distance in the parking lot of the stadium, where some people seemed to be still celebrating, but that was quite far from where I was. I looked at my cell phone and realized that it was already 3:30 in the morning. I called my mom to know how everything was going, and she told me that she had already stabilized my dad and was on her way out. She asked me if there were still people there, and I lied and told her yes so as not to worry her. Meanwhile, I got back in the car to continue washing the dishes and make time, since the trip from my house to the place where I was about 30 minutes. While I was doing that, I heard someone knocking on the counter window and I shouted from inside that it was closed. However, they knocked again, and I repeated that it was closed. They kept knocking, and by now I was getting nervous. I asked who was there and got no answer, but they stopped knocking. I waited a moment, deliberating whether it was a good idea to peek out, but I did. I opened the counter window and looked everywhere. But there was no one there, not a soul. I looked out to see if those who were partying in the parking lot were still there, and they were gone. And this was a very wide area where there were no trees or anything where someone could hide. It was a gigantic parking lot next to the baseball stadium, where there was nothing but streetlights and hundreds of meters of asphalt. I got out of the car and turned around, trying to see if there was anyone around, but there was no one. At that moment, I didn't know whether to be relieved or scared. I tried not to make a big deal of it and went back to the car to continue with my work, but I made sure to close the door and the window of the counter. As soon as I got into the car, they knocked on the window 3 times. At that moment, I didn't say anything. I just stayed attentive, and obviously my nerves began to surface. Again they knocked, and then again, and again, and again, and louder and louder. My heart began to pound. I really wanted with all my being that this was a bad joke. As crazy as it may seem, I plucked up my courage, and as they knocked on the window, I opened it with a bang to see who was there, and when I did, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no one. No one. With my breath hitching and my nerves on edge, I got out of the car again, and once again I turned it around and looked in all directions. I even peeked under it, but there was absolutely no one there. This time I ran into the car and locked myself in there again, but this time I had that creepy feeling of being watched. I sat down on the floor and looked for my cell phone in my pants pocket to call my mom, but I couldn't find it. Then I heard when they started knocking on the window again, and then the door and the metal walls, and suddenly it was as if 200 hands were hitting the car very hard. At that moment, panic gripped every fiber of my body. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. I threw myself on the floor and wrapped my body around myself while I covered my ears with the palms of my hands so as not to hear the pounding. Without realizing it, I began to scream frantically. I was so terrified that I felt my heart was going to explode, and the only thing I could do was scream and cry like crazy. The blows went on, and it went on like that for a while. I don't know how long. For me, it was an eternity. But from one moment to the next, they started to let up. However, I kept screaming hysterically, until at one point I could only hear a pair of hands banging desperately on the door and my hysterical screams. Suddenly I began to hear someone shouting my name over and over again, and then I recognized that voice. It was my mother's voice. When I realized that it was her, I finally opened my eyes and came to my senses. I realized that my mother was on the other side of the door, pounding her fists and calling me desperately. At that instant, I sat up as best I could and opened the door. My mother jumped in and began to check me up and down hysterically, asking me what was wrong, what had they done to me, why I was crying and screaming like that, etc., etc., etc. The poor thing was shaking, with a face full of tears and even more terrified than me, thinking that someone had hurt me. Then I realized that my mom had been outside the car for a while, listening to my screams and trying to get in, so I told her I was fine, but she was still like crazy checking me and asking me what happened to me. I just kept repeating that I was fine, that nobody had done anything to me. But at that moment, I didn't feel strong enough to talk about what happened, and that's how I let her know. My mom is the most understanding person in the world, so even in the middle of the panic, she understood me. So she just hugged me tightly, and I hugged her. And when we felt a little calmer, we picked up everything that was missing, hooked the car to the truck, and left as fast as we could. When we got home, I took a shower and went to sleep with my mom. I really didn't want to sleep alone. It was the next day that I told her everything that had happened, and she was very overwhelmed. She never imagined it was anything like that. After that day, there were many other games in that stadium, but not for all the gold in the world would I ever set foot in that place again. My name is Alma, and I am a thanatopractor. For those who don't know the term, a thanatopractor is in charge of receiving and preparing the bodies of the deceased, and then handing them over to their families for the funeral rituals. This is exactly the job he has been doing in a public hospital for more than 15 years. The hospital where I work is the largest and busiest in the city, so we have a heavy workload. Unfortunately, many of the bodies I receive on a daily basis belong to victims of car accidents or motorcycle accidents, and when it comes to these cases, the bodies generally arrive in really pitiful conditions, in a way that no family would want to see a loved one. So in those cases, I really do everything in my power to reconstruct them and try to make them look as close as possible to the person they were in life. It is a complicated task, and sometimes, no matter how hard I try, there is not much I can do. However, I always try to give the deceased as much dignity as possible. My work area is located in a basement that is quite far away from the consulting rooms, emergency and operating rooms. That is, from the area of the living. And for several years, I have been covering mostly the night shift. The mortuary is everything you would expect it to be. A gloomy, silent, and isolated place, full of empty bodies that only hours ago were people like you and me, who were walking, laughing, and making plans for a future that, in their case, will never come. Since I started working in this place a few years ago, I realized that there is definitely much more on the other side than we think, because yes, I have seen people that do not exist on this plane, objects that move on their own. I have heard laughter, crying, whispers, and I have even seen shadows walking around. This became an everyday thing. At first it was scary, but eventually you get used to it and just let it go. I don't bother them and they don't bother me, so I just do my job, and that's it. However, a couple of years ago, an event happened that really shook me up, and today I'm going to share it with you. That night, like almost every night, I arrived on time to cover my shift, and while walking down the hall, I ran into Mireya, one of my colleagues, and I asked her how the day was going and if we had much work. She replied that in fact there was nothing, something that surprised me pleasantly, since it was a Saturday, and unfortunately, that is one of the days with the highest incidence of road accidents in the city, but everything seemed to point to that it would be the first quiet Saturday night in a long time. Around 11 p.m., Margot, one of the hospital receptionists, informed me that Manuel, my partner and friend since college, would not be coming to work that night. This was really strange to me, since in the 7 years that we had been working together, he had never missed work, so I assumed that it must be something quite serious for him to decide to miss that day. The first thing that came to my mind was that maybe he had a family emergency, or something like that. But I was planning to call him in a while to see how everything was going, and what had happened to him. Manuel and I met in college. At first we liked each other and started dating, but then along the way we became best friends. After graduating, we drifted apart a bit because of our jobs, but 7 years ago he started working at this same hospital, and we had been co-workers ever since. The evening progressed in a strange calm that was supposed to be good, but it turns out that when you get used to having a hectic work pace, being idle is more torturous than having a lot of things to do. Suddenly I began to feel a great heaviness in my body, and when I saw that sleep was overcoming me, I decided to go up to the roof for a while to smoke a cigarette, something I usually did with Manuel, so at that moment I missed him. Then I remembered that I had not called him, so I took out my cell phone with the intention of dialing. However, at that moment, a couple of trauma nurses came upstairs who were just as unoccupied as I was that night, and we started to talk. So I forgot to call Manuel and put my cell phone in my pocket. After all, if anything important had happened to him, surely he would have contacted me by now. After talking to them for a while, I decided it was time to go down to my dungeon, as we called the mortuary area. But as I was walking down the hall, I saw Manuel coming in the opposite direction, and I called him. I wanted to ask him what had happened and if everything was all right, but instead of coming towards me, he just looked at me, smiled at me as usual, and went straight into his room. When I saw that he entered his area, I was about to go there to talk to him. But then I saw that one of the emergency nurses was running towards me. She looked agitated, and when I was about to ask her what was wrong, she interrupted me and told me that Manuel had had an accident and was in the emergency room. I was very confused. What do you mean in the emergency room? Manuel had just entered his room. I told the nurse that I had just seen him entering his area, and she looked at me as if I had grown a horn in my head. And she repeated that Manuel had just had an accident, and at that very moment he was being treated in the emergency room. She also warned me that his condition was really critical. When I heard that I was stunned, I walked forward and peeked into my friend's work area, and indeed he was not there. At that moment, a horrible shiver went up all over my body, and I prayed to God with all my might that it wasn't what I was thinking, but deep down inside I knew the worst had already happened. I left Manuel's area and I was ready to run to the emergency room, but when I was a few meters away from the exit of the morgue, the orderlies brought a stretcher with what would be the first body of the night. They were crying, so I did not need them to tell me anything to know what Manu was. Honestly, that was one of the most painful moments I have had to live so far. I could not describe in words what I felt when I saw my friend covered with a white sheet. No matter how accustomed you are to seeing lifeless bodies, no one prepares you to see a loved one depart. The reason Manuel said he would not be coming that night was because he started to feel very bad. His wife said he began to have a severe headache. Manu suffered from migraines, but she said that this time the pain was so severe that he could not even get out of bed to get ready to come to work. His wife insisted that he stay home, but he was very stubborn and told her that he would take a pill and then the pain would go away. She insisted so much that he stay home to rest that he finally agreed, took his pill and went to bed. But just as he predicted, after an hour the pain went away, and this time he did not listen to anyone. He simply got out of bed, got dressed, and got into his car to go to the hospital. However, when he was only a few blocks away, a pickup truck being driven by a drunk driver rammed into him at full speed, causing Manuel to lose control of his car and overturn, leaving him seriously injured. Paradoxically, the other driver was unhurt. That tragic day, the stretcher bearers helped me carry Manu's body to my living room, and when I was finally left alone with him, or with the body that once inhabited my dearest friend, I began to talk to him as I did every day. But I also told him how much I loved him and let him know that I was going to miss him terribly. Reminded him of all the beautiful times we had when we were students, thanked him for coming to say goodbye to me, and asked him to please rest in peace and not go around bothering me. I can swear that at the very moment I said those words, Manuel's body broke into a smile, and with that same smile, I gave his body to his family. Two years ago, I started working as a cleaning service in a well-known hotel in the city. At first, I was covering the morning shift, but as soon as there was a vacancy for the night shift, I asked to be changed to that schedule, since that shift paid more. Honestly, I really liked that schedule. Everything was quieter and there were fewer things to do. Besides, at that time we were in low season, so my job in that period basically consisted of passing the hours doing practically nothing. Every slacker's dream job. However, not all that glitters is gold, and it was on one of those days that I had the scariest experience of my life. That night, as it usually happens in the off-season, the hotel was almost empty. I always used to look for a quiet place to play games on my phone and snoop on social media, in short, to hang out. Although every once in a while I would take a stroll down the halls to get the cameras to see me so I could justify my paycheck. It was about 11 p.m. at the time, not long to go before my shift was over. I was on the top floor and I started to check what I had in the cart to make my inventory for the day, which I had to deliver at the end of my shift. I was doing that when suddenly I heard a knock on the wall in one of the rooms. First a sharp knock and then several knocks in a row. I immediately stopped what I was doing to pay attention to that noise. It sounded like they were hitting the wall very hard. The first thing I thought was that they were having a fight inside the room, and I knew that in those cases the protocol was to call security immediately, but I did not. Instead, I waited a while longer, and then I got a little closer to the wall to be able to distinguish some voice or something that could indicate that indeed a fight was happening there, but nothing was heard, only the blows. At the moment, some sobs were heard, as if someone was crying inside the room. Then they began to speak in a low voice. It was a woman's voice, but I could not understand what she was saying. I stood in front of the door, and when I was about to knock on it, I started to hear someone walking back and forth on the other side, followed by the knocking and sobbing again. This really alarmed me, so I decided to write through the WhatsApp work group, and they asked me what the room number was. I gave it to them, and a few seconds later the receptionist wrote back saying that that room was empty. This response took me very much by surprise, because I was clearly hearing that there was at least one person in that room. So I asked them to send a security officer to come and corroborate what I was telling them. For a moment, I was tempted to open the door myself, but the truth is that the matter began to scare me. So I took my cart and went to the elevator. Meanwhile, the knocking continued to be heard, and they were so loud that even from a distance they were still heard very clearly. It was as if someone was hitting the walls with great force. In a few minutes, the security guard arrived and I directed him towards the room where the sounds were being heard. But just as the elevator opened, the banging stopped. I went with him to make sure that there really was no one there, and indeed there was. The room was completely empty. The boy and I checked the entire room and the bathroom, but everything was empty. However, I could feel a very heavy energy in that place. It was something unpleasant that I would not know how to explain. We went out into the hallway and I asked the boy who went into the room to knock on one of the walls. The guard did it, and it was exactly the same sound I had heard before. After that, we checked one by one all the rooms on that floor and they were all empty. However, the heavy feeling I only felt in the room where the knocking was heard. I was really confused and a little nervous too, since it was the first time I had experienced something like that. After corroborating that everything was in order, if I can say so, we left the hallway and took the elevator again. Then it was time to deliver the shift, but I thought about what happened all the way home. But just when I arrived, I received a call from Doña Rosa, an employee who had been working at the hotel for many years, and she explained to me that it was not the first time that things were heard on that floor. On the contrary, it was very common. Then she told me that many years ago a woman lost her life in that room at the hands of her husband. It seems that the couple came to spend their vacations in that hotel, but the same night they stayed there, the man beat his wife to death. Unfortunately, at that time, all the rooms on that floor were empty and no one heard anything. It was not until a few days later, at checkout time, when they realized that these guests had not yet left the room, so they went upstairs to see what had happened. After knocking several times without getting an answer, they decided to open the door, and that is when they found the lifeless body of the woman, but her husband had fled. However, a few days later, he was captured by the police. Since then, there have been many employees and guests who have said they have heard the same knocking and crying that I heard that night. All of them believe that it is the soul of that poor woman that is still trapped in those four walls. After Doña Rosa's explanation, everything became clearer to me. But still, since that day, I avoid going to the top floor and I try to stay far away from that room. My name is Amanda, and I have been a nurse for more than 20 years. Since I graduated, I worked during the day at a local hospital. I am currently 40, married and have 2 teenage children. But 10 years ago, when I just turned 30 and my children were small, I wanted to have time to devote to them. Because due to my busy schedule at the hospital, my children spent most of my time with me. My children spent most of the day with a nanny, and I felt very guilty. I felt that I was missing the most important stage of their lives. So I decided to quit my job at the hospital and started working privately. That's when I was hired to take care of an elderly woman at her home at night. My work schedule was 8 hours, from 4 p.m. to 12 midnight. I had been in that job for about a year, when one night, the most chilling event I have ever experienced in my life happened to me. That night, like every night before, I left work at the usual time around midnight and was about to return home. However, when I tried to start my car, it started to fail. It had been having a small mechanical failure for a few days, but I had not had time to take it to the workshop. It still worked, but that night the failure worsened. I tried to start it several times without success until it finally started, but when I tried to reverse it out of the parking lot, it turned off again. Then it started again. But since it was a long drive to my house, I thought that it might be dangerous to leave at that hour with a car that was turning off out of nowhere, because I could have an accident on the road, and at that hour it would be dangerous. At that time, I didn't have my cell phone either, as I had left it at home because I left in a hurry. Then I also had no way to contact my husband to tell him to come and pick me up. I sat in the car for a while, trying not to panic and thinking of a way to communicate or to get home somehow. Near where I was, there was a 24-hour store, so I went over there, bought some candy, and asked the clerk if I could borrow his cell phone so I could call my husband. However, the phone rang several times and I got no answer. That night, my husband had pitched a tent with my children in the garden, and by this time they were probably asleep, or maybe he had left the phone inside the house and that's why he didn't answer me. In any case, I had to return the phone to the guy who kindly lent it to me. But before doing so, I sent a text message to my husband, hoping he would see him soon. Since I had no way of knowing if he had seen him or not, and not having my cell phone, he wouldn't be able to reach me either. I felt like I was running out of options. It had already been an hour, it was close to 1 a.m., and I still hadn't found a way to get home. As I was standing there outside the store thinking about how the hell I was going to get home, and deliberating whether it would be wise to try to get there with the car failing as it was, I saw a big 18-wheeler pull up and stop right in front of where I was standing. As I got out of the truck, maybe because I noticed concern, or because it was strange to see a woman alone standing in front of a store at that hour, the driver of the huge vehicle asked me if I had a problem. Clearly, I had a big problem. But this man was a perfect stranger, so I just told him that everything was fine. Then he asked me, "Are you sure?" And I told him that actually my car was damaged, but my husband was already on his way to pick me up. He smiled kindly, and to my surprise told me that he knew I had been standing there for quite a while, as he had stopped by earlier to make a delivery and saw me in that place. So when he came back, he decided to stop at the store. The man seemed like a nice person after all. That's something not everyone does, that is, noticing that a stranger is in trouble and stopping his business to go and help him. I thanked him for the gesture, but told him not to worry. I told him that I had already left a message for my husband, and any minute now, he would see it and come for me. The man told me that he didn't want to leave me there, that it would make him feel terrible, and he would be worried about my safety. I thanked him again, and realizing that he was probably right about it not being safe to be there at that time of night and alone, I asked him to do me a favor and drive me to the next 24-hour service station that was on the next exit. That way, if I had to spend the night out, at least I would be in a safe place, and I could use the payphone to call my husband. The driver gladly agreed, so I went to my car, picked up my keys, my purse, my things, locked the car, and went back to the store where the man's truck was parked, and climbed into the passenger seat of the huge vehicle. Then the man started up and began to drive down the highway. As he did so, we made small talk. He asked me how many children I had. I told him 2, and we had one of those conversations that are completely normal between strangers. But as I was talking, I noticed him slowing down, and I realized that he was stopping the truck. By this time, we had gone a little over a mile. I could still see the store where I was standing a moment ago in the rear-view mirror. At that point, I felt alarmed and asked him what was going on. But then he started talking, and I noticed that his attitude, posture, and manner of speaking had changed drastically. There, I began to feel fear and realized that I had made a terrible decision in trusting this man, and those kinds of mistakes usually pay dearly. As I stared straight ahead, the man asked me, "Your husband is not really coming, is he?" I was about to answer him, but before I could utter a word, he continued, "Nobody cares about you. If he really cared about you, he would have been here already. If he cared about you, he would have noticed that you hadn't come home and he would have come looking for you. If he really cared about you, he would have bought you a nice car and not one that can leave you stranded anywhere. You don't even have a cell phone." I started crying out of sheer fear and begged him to please let me out of the truck. I assured him that my husband was on his way and begged him to let me go back to where I was to wait for him. He then told me that that was not very smart of me, and warned me that if I did that, I could be hit or hurt in some way. Although he did not specify who would do that, he said it as if he was talking about someone else. I was completely terrified and begged him again to let me go and wait for my husband. Then I noticed that he had his eyes completely fixed forward at all times. He never turned to look at me. It was as if he was in some kind of trance. And before I could speak again, out of nowhere he asked me, "Who raised you?" The question completely unhinged me. I stared at him and blinked a couple of times. I was confused, but I answered, "My mother. My mother raised me." That's when he looked back at me and simply said, "Good answer. I also had a mother who raised me, and that is what is saving your life today." After saying those words, the man looked back to the front, took a deep breath, took out his cell phone and handed it to me. He said, "Call your husband and tell him to come get you, and don't call anyone else. Just him." Although that was the only thing he said to me at that moment, I knew those words meant something. I knew that if my husband didn't answer me, it would surely be the end of me. With that in mind and dead panicked, I dialed my husband's number, praying to all the saints that this time he would answer. The phone began to ring, but no one answered. My heart was pounding and my body was completely rigid. The phone kept ringing and nothing, but when I had already resigned myself to die that night, I finally heard his voice. My husband answered. At that moment, I let out all the air I was holding in and trying to hide my nervousness. I explained that my car had broken down on the road and that I needed him to come immediately for me. My husband, completely unaware of what I was going through at that moment, told me that it was going to take him a little time, since he had to get the tools to check my car, and also take the children to the bedroom because they were still in the tent. At that instant, I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my mouth. I was between despair, anguish, and helplessness. So trying to control the trembling in my voice, I told him that I was in a big truck with a man and that I needed him to come right away. He began to question what I was talking about, as he didn't understand that I was in real danger, so I told him in a firm voice, "You need to come now." I handed the phone back to the man, who was still staring straight ahead, leaned back straight, and once again saw out of the corner of my eye the store several meters away. The next few minutes passed torturously slow and in complete silence, except for my own heart beating like a drum. It was then when, in the distance, I saw in the rearview mirror the lights of a vehicle parked near where my car had been damaged. The driver of the truck could see it too, and before I could open my mouth to tell him it was my husband, he asked me to get out of the truck and go find him. I opened the door as fast as I could and jumped out of the truck, almost fell, but quickly stabilized myself, and totally terrified, I ran down the road towards my husband, before the truck driver could regret it. When I got to where my husband was, who had already gotten out of the car and taken out the tools to repair mine, I told him to pack up everything, get in the truck and drive as fast as he could home. He looked at me like I had grown a third eye and asked me what the hell was going on. I told him I would tell him on the way, so he did as I asked, gathered up all the tools, got in the car and drove fast. The truck was still parked in the same spot when we passed on the side. I didn't even want to look to get a better view of the truck or the crazy man. All I wanted was to get out of that place and get home. But then he started to follow us, and when I saw the truck coming behind us, I felt my heart was going to pound out of my chest, and I told my husband to speed up. He was very confused because at the time I had not yet told him what had happened, but he just wanted to get out of there. Up ahead, I saw that the exit was approaching, and to go home we had to take the road to the right, and then I saw that when we crossed, the truck continued in a straight line, and we lost him there. I can't describe the relief I felt when the truck went straight ahead, and I stopped seeing it in the rearview mirror. At that point, I finally started to tell my husband what had happened, but when he heard my story, he got very upset and started to scold me for my foolishness, asking me what the hell I was thinking when I decided to get into a truck with a perfect stranger. I really started to feel very guilty, because I know I was right and that this recklessness on my part could have had fatal consequences. One of the thoughts that never left my head was that if that man had hurt me, I would have left my children orphaned, and just thinking about it made me feel tormented. I really felt very stupid for what I did. That's why I never dared to report it. I didn't have more details to give either, since I didn't even take the license plate of the truck and the description I could give of the man fits that of any other truck driver. To this day, I wonder if that man really was a serial killer. If he had done that before, it torments me to think that maybe there were other victims who were not as lucky as me. Although I really prefer to think that he was just a guy with nothing better to do than to tease a woman alone at those hours just for fun. The truth is that this experience marked my life completely. Since then, I am very cautious and I have never gotten into a stranger's car again.